Welcome to the life of a poor worker in 18th century Paris. You might think of Paris as the city of romance, fine wine and cobblestone streets, but for the average worker, it's more like a giant stinky obstacle course with rats as your only friends. Your bed is a sack of straw that barely counts as a mattress. Your breakfast is stale bread with watered down wine. And your job, well, it's spent hunched over a loom, making fabric for people who don't even know you exist. But hey, no worries. At least you'll get a meagre piece of bread for all that hard work. So buckle up for a hilarious, uncomfortable look at the real Paris. The one where survival is your daily grind and comfort is a foreign concept. But before we do that, drop a like or leave a comment, maybe even subscribe if you really like the stories we tell here. Who knows, maybe we can find some inspiration in the past to improve our present. You wake up with a jolt. The sharp, biting cold cutting through your worn blanket before your eyes even open. It's not a soft morning stretch you're greeted with, but the immediate discomfort of the room around you. The walls are thin, the cold stone floors unforgiving, and the dampness of the air clings to everything. The blanket, more like a piece of cloth than anything you'd consider a bed covering, does little to keep you warm. It's the kind of blanket that might make you shiver even in the summer, and in this tiny room where you sleep, eat and live, it's hardly enough to shield you from the chill. As a textile worker in 18th century Paris, you know that life won't get any warmer. Your bed isn't really a bed at all. It's a pile of straw stuffed into a burlap sack. The straw sticks out in places, making it uncomfortable to even lie down, and when you shift in the middle of the night, it pokes you in ways that make you wonder how many other workers share the same agony. But you've gotten used to it. The discomfort has become second nature, part of your daily survival. You sit up, groaning, as your body protests the movement. Every muscle in your body aches from the awkward angle you slept in. The factory hours are long, and though you don't remember the last time you had a good night's rest, there's no time to dwell on that. You get up slowly, your feet cold against the hard wood of the floor, the chill of the room clinging to your skin like an unwanted shadow. There's no time to linger in bed. The day is already calling. You drag your feet to the basin in the corner of the room. The water inside is cold, unwelcoming, but it's all you've got. There's no luxury of a warm bath or even a nice splash of water from the river nearby. It's just this, a basin of cold, stagnant water. You dip your hands into it, wincing at the shock of the cold against your skin. You can feel the water cut through your exhaustion, but it doesn't do anything to rejuvenate you. You splash it on your face, hoping for a jolt of energy, but instead, all you get is the cold bite that brings your senses back to the harshness of your existence. You wipe your face with a rag, the same rag you've used for months, its fabric worn thin from too many washes. The rag feels like sandpaper against your skin, rough and irritating, but it's all you have. There's no soft towel to comfort you, no plush cloth to dry your face. This is the reality of your life, discomfort and survival, plain and simple. Your stomach growls in protest as you look at the meagre breakfast you have. You can smell the stale bread before you even reach for it. The loaf is hard as a rock, probably yesterday's bread, maybe even from a few days ago. Bread was once a luxury, but for someone like you, a textile worker in Paris, it's a small piece of comfort in a life that offers little else. You tear off a chunk, but it resists, as if it's made from something far harder than wheat and water. Your teeth ache as you try to break it apart. The bread is dry, almost too tough to chew. It sticks to the roof of your mouth, and you swallow it with difficulty, wondering if it will ever go down. If you're lucky, there's a sliver of cheese to go with the bread, though it's not much to boast about. It's sour and old, just like the bread. But the cheese is something at least. More often than not, it's just the bread, and you're left staring at it, wondering if this will be your lunch as well. To wash down the bread, you take a gulp from the cup beside you, but the drink isn't what you might hope for. It's watered down wine. Nothing like the rich, flavourful wine that you've heard the nobility enjoy. This wine's been stretched thin with water, barely holding on to the taste of grapes. It's barely drinkable, but it's wet, and for now that's enough. There's no clean water in the room, no fresh well to dip your cup into. The wine is all you have. It's part of the daily ritual of survival. It may not taste good, it may not refresh you, but it keeps the thirst at bay. That's the best you can hope for. You sit quietly for a moment, the food barely enough to stave off hunger, the wine lingering in your throat. Your hands feel stiff, and your body aches from the hard bed and the long hours in the factory. As a textile worker, you spend your days hunched over looms, weaving fabric for the wealthy. But this morning, as every morning, is just about getting through the bare minimum. There's no joy in the food, no satisfaction in the moment. It's all just a step in the routine that is your life. Once the bread is finished and the wine swallowed, you push yourself away from the table. There's no time to linger. The factory is waiting. It's not like you have a choice. You can't afford to miss a day. If you do, you might not make enough to pay for your room, your bread, or the little bit of wine you're lucky enough to get. As much as you want to sleep longer, as much as you wish you could have more time to rest, the truth is simple. You work, or you starve. That's the reality for someone like you, a worker in one of the many small textile factories that line the streets of Paris. You reach for your clothes, though they're little more than rags themselves. The coat you pull on is threadbare, the sleeves frayed and patched in places where the fabric has worn thin. It's too big for you, but it's all you've got. The shoes, if you can even call them shoes, are barely holding together. The leather is cracked, the soles worn down to nothing. You've walked miles in these shoes, and yet they still have to last. You wonder how long before they finally give out on you, but you can't afford to worry about that. You put them on anyway, because there's no other option. You look at yourself in the small cracked mirror hanging by the door. Your reflection stares back at you, tired and worn. The bags under your eyes are a reminder of the long hours you've spent at the loom, the endless nights where sleep doesn't come easy. Your skin is pale, your body thin from hunger, but you're used to it by now. This is your life, hard, exhausting, and without much to show for it. There's no real satisfaction in the work you do. You don't get to create beautiful fabrics for yourself or enjoy the art of your labour. Instead, it's about surviving, about getting by. Every day is a fight to hold on to the barest of comforts, and even that seems like a distant dream. You gather your things and prepare to leave the room. The factory is just a short distance away, but even that feels like too much some days. You wish for a day off, for a break from the constant grind, but that's not an option. Not for someone like you. You leave your room, pulling your coat tighter against the cold, your shoes scraping against the cobblestones as you step outside. But that's a story for later. For now, the focus is on this moment. The first moments of the day. The discomfort, the hunger, the cold, and the realization that tomorrow will be just like today. The life of a textile worker in 18th century Paris is one of endless labour, of struggle for survival, But you keep moving forward, because what else can you do? This is your world, and though it offers little, it's still the only one you know. You've barely managed to get through the discomfort of your morning routine, and now it's time to face the streets. You button up your coat, though, let's be honest, calling it a coat is a stretch. It's a patched up relic of something once finer, but now it's just a cold, thin piece of fabric doing its best to shield you from the elements. You take a breath, preparing yourself for what comes next, but you know it's not going to be easy. You step outside, and BAM! The immediate assault on your senses hits you. The noise, the smell, the sheer chaos of it all. It's like Paris is alive and you're just a tiny speck trying to survive inside this living, breathing mess. You stand there for a moment, taking it all in. The street is filled with people, carts, horses, and a cacophony of shouts. There's no way to ignore it. The streets are a never-ending maze of bodies and noise. The first thing you notice is the stench. It's not subtle. You can smell it before you even see the source. The air is thick with the smell of horse manure, decaying food, and the unmistakable odour of open sewage. You've grown used to it. Sort of. But it still makes your stomach churn every time you step outside. There's no real sewage system in Paris, so all the waste from the bustling city just pours into the streets. Puddles of water mix with whatever else has been discarded, and they're impossible to avoid. The streets might look like they're cobbled together, but the truth is, they're more like a public toilet with the occasional stray dog wandering around looking for a bite to eat. And if you're unlucky, you might be the one they mistake for food. You're doing your best to dodge the puddles as you move, but it's a losing battle. At some point you step right into it, a thick, foul mess that splashes up the sides of your shoes. You try to shake it off, but that's impossible in a city like this. Paris, with its overcrowded streets and cramped alleys, doesn't offer you much in the way of personal space or hygiene. The smell clings to you, and it's as much a part of life as anything else. There's no escaping it. And then there's the noise. It's everywhere. The clattering of carts as they roll over the cobblestone streets, the shouts of street vendors trying to sell their wares, the squealing of horses. It's a constant symphony of chaos. If you didn't know any better, you might think the whole city was fighting for attention. But that's how it is in Paris. Everyone is in a hurry. Everyone is struggling to get by, and there's no room for anyone to slow down. You push your way through the crowd, trying to stay on course, but the sheer number of people makes it feel impossible. You're constantly jostled, constantly bumped into. Everyone is trying to get somewhere, but there's no rhyme or reason to it. You have to shove your way through, stepping on other people's feet just to make any progress. As you weave your way through the masses, you catch sight of the wealthy, strolling by as if they have all the time in the world. They walk with their heads held high, their coats pristine, their shoes polished. The women's skirts are long, the men's wigs are powdered just so. They pass by without a care, oblivious to the chaos of the streets, or perhaps even enjoying it from the safety of their comfortable lives. You can't help but feel the sting of envy, but you bury it quickly. It's not your world. It's never been your world. They can afford to walk down these streets without worrying about stepping in something unpleasant or getting run over by a horse-drawn cart. The sound of hooves clattering on the cobblestones pulls you back into the reality of your own existence. A cart barrels by, the driver paying no attention to your presence as the horses nearly clip your shoulder. You jump back, barely avoiding a collision, and the driver gives you a quick, uninterested glance as if you're the one at fault. It's a daily dance in Paris. The streets are the battlegrounds where you're constantly fighting to keep your space. The aristocrats ride by in their carriages, moving with ease and grace, while you're left dodging the dangers of the street and doing your best to avoid being crushed by the very system that keeps you at the bottom. You take a moment to catch your breath as you move to the side of the street, but there's no rest to be found. The streets are always filled with people. Workers, merchants, children, beggars, all of them rushing to their destinations. The overcrowding is overwhelming. You can barely move an inch without bumping into someone else, and no one seems to care. The poor are jostled by the rich are too busy to notice the poor, and you're just a speck in the crowd trying to get to work. There's no politeness in the air. If you're in the way, you get shoved aside. If you don't move fast enough, someone will walk straight over you. The more you think about it, the more you realise how much your entire life revolves around this. The constant struggle to get from one place to another, the constant fight for space, the constant noise. The streets are a reminder of your place in the world, a small cog in a giant grinding machine that doesn't care whether you survive or not. All you can do is keep moving forward, keep pushing through the crowd, and hope that the next few steps don't land you in something worse than you've already encountered. And then there's the disease. Paris is teeming with it. The close quarters, the lack of sanitation, the filth of the streets. It's the perfect breeding ground for cholera, smallpox, and the ever-present plague. You've seen it happen before. People coughing in the streets, their bodies racked with fever, their faces pale and drawn. Some collapse where they stand, and others are carried off to the nearest doctor, or, more often, left to die in the streets. Disease is just another part of life in Paris, another constant threat that looms over everyone. You try not to think about it, but the reality is unavoidable. One wrong step, one bad cough, and you could be next. You move faster now, trying to get to work, trying to escape the grim reality of the streets. The closer you get to your factory, the more you realise that the day hasn't even begun, and yet it already feels like it's taking everything out of you. The noise, the filth, the danger, it all adds up. But you can't stop. There's no time to dwell on it. You push through the crowds, dodging another horse, avoiding another puddle of waste, and keep your head down. The factory is ahead, but even that doesn't promise relief. The factory, like the streets, is its own world. A world of overwork, underpay, and endless hours spent hunched over a loom, weaving fabric for people who will never appreciate the labour that went into it. You think about the hours you'll spend today, hours that won't bring you any closer to a better life. The aristocrats will still be enjoying their lavish dinners while you will be stuck inside, fighting to stay awake as you work with the rough wool, weaving, stitching, and creating the very cloth that will adorn their bodies. You won't see the final product. You won't feel the reward. You'll just keep working. The factory is your destination, but the streets are your reality. The journey is always just as hard as the destination. You've learned to survive the streets, to dodge the dangers, to ignore the smells, the noise, and the chaos. It's not easy. It's never easy. But as long as you keep moving, you'll get to work, and that's what counts. The factory looms ahead, and just like every day, it's as imposing as a fortress. The stone walls are cold and grey, the windows small and covered in grime. The air around it smells like rust, sweat, and machinery, an unmistakable scent that means you're about to spend the next several hours trapped in a place that will drain the life out of you, piece by piece. The only question is, how much life will you have left by the end of the day? As you approach, you feel the familiar ache in your muscles, the anticipation of yet another grueling shift. You can already hear the clanking of the looms inside, the steady rhythm of metal against fabric, the relentless sound that fills the air of the factory. You pause for just a moment before stepping inside. It's always the same. Once you enter, you're swallowed whole by the noise, the heat, and the chaos. The noise is deafening, but there's no escaping it. It's the sound of work, of effort, of survival. You step through the heavy wooden doors which creak under your weight as if complaining about being opened one more time. Inside, the factory is a world of constant movement. The air is thick, filled with the smell of oiled machines, sweat, and the mustiness of too many people crammed into too small a space. The overhead lights, flickering with age, do little to illuminate the dark corners of the factory floor, but you don't need the light. You know this space by heart. The looming looms are everywhere, stretching far across the factory floor, their long wooden arms creaking as they move. Workers are bent over, hunched over their machines, their hands moving in a blur of motion that is both mechanical and human. The looms have no mercy. They require constant attention, constant effort, and every worker knows they'll never stop running until the shift ends. You take your place at one of the looms, where you've spent more hours than you care to remember. The machine feels like an extension of your body now. You know its rhythm, its sound, and its demands. You set your hands on the rough wooden handles, and as soon as you do, the machine comes to life. It starts with a deep, low groan of gears and wood, and before you know it, you're lost in the movement, your fingers flying across the shuttle. The work is monotonous. The rhythm of the loom is almost hypnotic, a constant back and forth motion that never lets up. It's like you're trapped in an endless loop, the shuttle sliding in and out, the threads weaving together to form fabric that will be sold to the wealthy elite, those who will never know the exhaustion you feel. There's something soul-crushing about it. The fact that you'll spend hours creating something beautiful, something intricate, and yet you'll never see the fruits of your labour. The fabric you produce will end up in the hands of the aristocrats, worn in their homes and shops while you're stuck here, making more and more of it for barely enough money to survive. Your back aches from the hours of bending over the loom, your neck stiff and sore from the constant strain, but there's no time for rest. You've learned to ignore the pain, to push through it, because that's the only way to survive. The loom doesn't care if you're in pain, if you're exhausted, or if you're hungry. It keeps going, and you have no choice but to keep up. Every time you pull the shuttle across the threads, it feels like your muscles are screaming, but you don't stop. You can't. Not unless you want to risk being fired. And if you get fired, there's no guarantee you'll find work again. The world outside the factory isn't any kinder. There's a constant grinding noise in the factory, the sound of dozens of looms running simultaneously. It's a harsh, mechanical noise that fills the space and makes your ears ring. The dust is thick in the air, swirling around you as you work. You can feel it settle on your skin, on your lungs. But there's no time to think about that. You just keep working, your hands moving automatically. The air is stifling in the factory, the heat unbearable. The windows are small and covered in grime, barely letting in any light. It's hot enough to make you sweat through your thin, worn shirt. You feel the dampness of it stick to your back, but there's no escape. You work until your fingers are raw, until your arms ache, and until the day finally ends. And yet, despite the fatigue and discomfort, you can't stop. You have no choice but to keep going. Your family depends on you. You need to make enough to feed them, to keep the roof over your head. But it's not just the physical toll that wears you down. It's the monotony of the work. The fact that each day is exactly like the one before. You create beautiful fabric, and yet you never see it beyond the loom. You never feel the satisfaction of wearing something you've made. Instead, the fabric will be sold to someone who's never lifted a finger in their life, and they'll live in comfort while you keep weaving, day after day, night after night. You glance over at the other workers, each of them in their own world. There's no time to talk, no time for camaraderie. Everyone is focused on their looms, their hands flying over the shuttle in a rhythmic pattern that could almost be mistaken for dancing if it weren't for the exhaustion on everyone's faces. Some of the workers are older, their bodies hunched from years of labour, their faces lined with the marks of time and hardship. They've been doing this for longer than you have, and you can tell that the years of work have taken their toll. But there's no way out. They'll keep working until they can't anymore, and then someone else will take their place. You feel the burning ache in your muscles, the strain of the constant movement. It's like the loom is eating away at you, slowly but surely. Your back is sore from hunching over, your arms sore from the repeated motion. You try to shake it off, but it's always there. A constant reminder that you're just another cog in the machine. But that's life. That's the life of a textile worker in Paris in the 18th century. You work, you survive, and you try not to think about the toll it's taking on your body. The hours drag on. You glance up at the clock on the wall. It seems like the day should be over by now, but no, it's still early. You know you've got hours to go before the shift ends. You try to distract yourself by thinking about the food you'll have when the day is done, but you know it won't be much. Maybe some bread, maybe a bit of cheese if you're lucky, but nothing to make the fatigue go away, nothing to make the grinding exhaustion of the day worth it. You notice a worker at the loom beside you starting to slow down. His movements are a bit more sluggish than they were this morning. You can tell he's struggling, but he doesn't stop. No one stops. If you stop, you risk falling behind. If you fall behind, you risk being reprimanded, or worse. The foreman, a short, balding man with a permanent scowl, watches over the factory floor like a hawk, making sure everyone keeps up the pace. There's no leniency, no mercy. It's all about production, all about output. It doesn't matter if you're tired, if your fingers are raw, or if you haven't had a proper meal in days. The foreman doesn't care. If you're not working, you're not producing, and if you're not producing, you're no use to anyone. So you keep working. The fabric begins to take shape, the threads woven together into something tangible, something useful. But it's not for you. It never is. You're just the person who makes it. The hands that craft something beautiful, something useful, and yet you'll never see it again. It'll be sold to someone who can afford it, while you remain here, making more and more fabric, working long hours, and earning just enough to get by. By the time the shift ends, you feel like you've aged a decade. Your muscles are sore, your back is stiff, and your hands feel like they've been ground down to the bone. The workers begin to filter out of the factory, their faces tired, their movements sluggish. Some of them walk with a slight limp, a result of years spent at the loom. But there's no relief, no respite. Tomorrow you'll wake up and do it all over again. You prepare to leave the factory, the noise of the looms still echoing in your head. The streets of Paris are going to be just as chaotic as ever. The factory has swallowed all your energy, leaving you with just enough to make it home. You don't think about the work tomorrow, or the toll it's taking on your body. You just think about surviving the rest of the day. You drag yourself home. the weight of the day pressing down on your shoulders like a sack of rocks. The factory bell has long since rung, signalling the end of another long, back-breaking day. But don't let that fool you. There's no end of the day feeling for someone like you. Oh, sure, the clock says it's over, but for you, it's just a brief intermission in a play that never ends. The streets outside are as chaotic as always. Horses pulling carts, merchants shouting at the top of their lungs, and people bumping into you like they've never seen another human being before. The noise is deafening. The air thick with the smells of rotting food, manure, and whatever else has decided to decompose in the streets. But you've learned to ignore it. You've learned to push through the crowd, step over the puddles, and pretend like you're not suffocating under the weight of the world around you. But no matter how hard you try, the thought keeps creeping in, the exhaustion. It's not just physical anymore, it's mental, emotional, spiritual. You can't remember the last time you didn't feel like a tired, broken down machine. Your body aches. Your back is stiff from hours hunched over the loom, and your mind... Oh, your mind is just begging for a little peace, a break, a nap that doesn't feel like it's draining the life out of you. You stumble into your building, your worn shoes scraping against the cobblestones, and push open the creaky door to your tiny room. The moment you step inside, the familiar sight greets you. The cold, the damp, and the sprawling mess that is your so-called home. You drop your coat on the floor, no point in hanging it up. It's as tired as you are. The place hasn't seen a cleaning in ages, and even if it had, you wouldn't notice. A small bed stuffed with straw, a ragged blanket, and a broken window letting in just enough cold air to keep you from getting too comfortable. Welcome home, right? You collapse onto the bed, and it's like falling into a puddle of rocks. The straw pokes you in all the wrong places, and the blanket, well, it's not much more than a piece of cloth that barely covers you. But there's no use complaining. You've been here before. You know the drill. The cold is your constant companion, and the discomfort is the price of survival. You roll over, trying to find a position that doesn't make your spine scream in protest. But there's no escape from the reality of it. This is your life. Long days of mind-numbing labour, followed by nights of exhaustion that never let you rest. You close your eyes, but the noise from the street outside doesn't give you any peace. You hear the carts rolling by, the voices of passers-by, and the occasional shout of someone fighting over a loaf of stale bread. And it hits you. The thought that always comes, no matter how much you try to push it away. Is this it? Is this my life? You think about tomorrow, and for a second you just want to cry. Another day, another round of miserable bread and meagre wine. Another long shift at the loom, where your muscles will scream and your hands will bleed, all for fabric that someone else will wear and appreciate while you're left to scrape by. The wealthy will continue to wear their finely crafted clothes, sipping on wine that you'll never taste, and you'll keep working day after day in the hope that maybe, just maybe, one day something might change. But deep down, you know it won't. It never does. And then, as you lie there staring at the cracked ceiling, something shifts inside you. A thought that's been creeping in for a while now. A thought that refuses to stay buried any longer. Enough. You let out a deep sigh. It's not a sigh of relief. It's a sigh of resignation. But as the weight of the day's exhaustion pulls you down into the depth of your half-sleep, the thought lingers. This cycle can't keep going. Maybe tomorrow, just maybe, it'll be different. Maybe tomorrow you'll wake up and something will have changed. Maybe the factory will be a little more bearable, or the bread will be just a little fresher. Maybe you'll have a tiny bit of peace, but you know in your heart of hearts that nothing ever changes. The work will always be hard. The food will always be scarce. The rich will always walk by, pretending they don't see you as you slave away for their comfort. But tonight, the thoughts get darker. Your stomach growls, not for food, but for justice. You can feel it stirring in you like a wildfire that's been sparked by the tiniest of embers. Anger, frustration, resentment. You've worked so hard, and for what? The rich sit in their cosy homes sipping their wine while you break your back day in and day out. It doesn't seem fair, does it? And that's when it hits you. That's when you realise the absurdity of it all. You're working yourself to the bone, day after day, and yet you're the one who's starving. You're the one who's dying a little bit each time you step into that factory. But the ones who live in luxury, who never have to worry about where their next meal is coming from, they live in comfort. And that's when it hits you. Why do they get to live like that, while you get nothing? For a brief, fleeting moment, you imagine a world where you're not a textile worker, where you don't have to work yourself to the bone for a loaf of stale bread. You imagine a world where everyone is equal, where no one has to fear disease, starvation, or exhaustion. You imagine a world where the poor aren't invisible, where your work is valued, where your suffering isn't ignored. It's a silly thought, a fleeting fantasy, but for that moment, it feels real. You sit up, the bed creaking under you, and think about the day ahead. You'll wake up, eat whatever scraps you can find, and head to the factory for another long, hard day of work. But the thought won't leave you. The idea that you deserve better, that everyone deserves better, sticks with you. What if you could change this? What if there was a way to stop the endless cycle, to fight back, to demand something better? But that moment of hope floats away when you realise that's not how it works. Not for people like you. Not for people like us. The system is built to keep you down, to keep you tired, exhausted and silent. You're just a worker, a cog in a machine. But in your gut, in your tired, aching bones, you feel the fire building. Maybe tomorrow won't be better. Maybe the factory will still suck the life out of you, one thread at a time. But maybe, just maybe, you'll do something about it. You fall back onto the bed with a sigh, this time one of frustration rather than resignation. Your muscles scream in pain as you try to sleep, but your mind keeps turning. The struggle never ends, but the anger, that's new. Tomorrow, you'll wake up and do it all over again. But tomorrow might just be the start of something different, and you can feel it in your bones. As you lie there, the weight of the day's labour still pressing down on you, the growing fire inside begins to take shape. Tomorrow will be more of the same. Another grueling day of work, more aches, more exhaustion. But now there's something different in the air. The cycle of survival is wearing thin, and the question of why is no longer so easy to ignore. Maybe, just maybe, tomorrow isn't just about surviving. It might be the day everything changes. The worker may be weary, but something deeper is stirring. A desire for change that refuses to be silenced. Now let's delve into the historical and societal context of the mess that was France in the 18th century. In other words, why was your life so miserable during this period? Picture this. The ruler, Louis XVI, sitting comfortably in the Grand Palace of Versailles, sipping wine while you, the poor worker, are barely surviving on a stale loaf of bread. While the king lives it up with lavish feasts and golden thrones, you're crammed into a tiny room with a straw mattress that feels like a punishment from the gods. But hey, don't worry, You'll just get to enjoy a day full of back-breaking labour in the factory that's feeding this royal excess. Louis XVI and his royal crew weren't just living large, they were actively sinking France under piles of debt. They didn't hesitate to spend on luxury wars, like the American Revolution, that drained the treasury while the common people starved. Versailles was practically a palace of greed, funded by the hard-earned money of the peasants, including you. And while you're fighting to make enough to survive another day, the nobility is spending their days worrying about the feathers on their hats. Speaking of the nobility, let's talk about those wonderful people. The Second Estate, also known as the nobility, didn't lift a finger for their wealth. They didn't need to. They were born with silver spoons in their mouths. And guess who paid for it? That's right. You, the hard-working textile worker. The nobility didn't need to work, and yet they lived in luxurious estates, ate off golden plates, and paraded around like royalty. Oh wait, they were royalty. Meanwhile, you're stuck weaving fabric all day long, only for that fabric to end up in the hands of those who couldn't care less about your suffering. Then there's the First Estate, the church. You know, the same folks who keep telling you to be humble and suffer because God will reward you in the afterlife. Meanwhile, the priests are living in grand palaces, enjoying untaxed wealth and raking in money from the tithes of poor people. This isn't about saving souls, it's about keeping the poor in line while the church and nobles live in comfort. The clergy didn't just preach, they had their own private estates, and the poor, well, they just had to wait for their reward in heaven. And speaking of rewards, let's get to the real kicker. Taxes. The Third Estate, also known as you, was the one being taxed to oblivion, tail, gabelle and more, while the First Estate, the church, and the Second Estate, the nobility, had tax exemptions. Yeah, you were basically the donkey carrying the weight for everyone else. The nobles, they didn't pay a penny in taxes. The clergy, nothing. And where did the tax money go? To funding royal debauchery and extravagant parties, not to improving your life in the slightest. But we will talk about the taxes in detail later. So, every time you drag yourself to work in that factory, remember, you're not just toiling for your own survival. You're financing the king's luxuries, the nobles' feasts and the church's opulence. And how do they show their thanks? By never lifting a finger to help you. You might be weaving fabric for their clothes, but you'll never get the satisfaction of seeing your work get the respect it deserves. Instead, you get just enough bread and watered-down wine to keep your body alive for another shift. And what happens if you dare to complain about the unfairness? Well, that's simple. Nothing changes. The nobles keep eating their caviar, the church keeps taking your money, and you just keep working. But wait, there's more. As if this wasn't enough, the system ensures that you stay at the bottom. The nobles and royals don't just enjoy their wealth, they actively make sure you stay mired in poverty. You can work yourself to the bone, but your place in society is already set. You're a peasant, and no amount of hard work will ever make you rich enough to live like they do. In fact, the more you work, the harder it becomes to break free from this oppressive system. But here's the point that stings the most. You're financing the luxury of the rich, and they aren't even trying to hide the fact that they think they're better than you. They walk by, heads held high, in their shiny coats while you're dodging manure on the cobblestone streets. The monarchy and nobility don't see you. They don't care that you're hungry and exhausted. As far as they're concerned, you exist to serve them, and if you don't, well, there's always someone else ready to take your place. All right, now that we've discussed the glamorous lives of Louis XVI and his noble pals, let's get down to the nitty-gritty of the taxes. And let me tell you, France's tax system wasn't just unfair. It was a masterclass in making sure the rich stayed rich, while the rest of the population, you included, kept getting buried under the weight of their greed. If you were poor in 18th century France, you didn't get to take a day off from paying taxes. The third estate, that's you, had to pay land taxes, poll taxes, sales taxes, salt taxes, basically any tax that didn't involve being rich. The nobles, they paid nothing, absolutely nothing, 0 taxes. In fact, they lived tax-free, which meant that every piece of bread you ate, every gallon of wine you sloshed down, was taxed to the bone just to fund their luxurious lifestyles. You're busting your back working at the loom for pennies, but those rich nobles, they were throwing banquets, hosting lavish balls, and drinking expensive wine that probably cost more than your annual salary. And what did they contribute? Nothing. They didn't pay taxes, they didn't work for their money, and worst of all, they didn't even have the decency to acknowledge that you were the one keeping the economy afloat while you were starving. They didn't even need to break a sweat. But it gets better. You're thinking, okay, at least some of my hard-earned tax money's going toward the greater good, right? Well, here's the kicker. The money was being wasted on royal extravagance. You're paying for wars you're not even a part of. Paying for a king who's stuffing his face with 5-course meals, and all the while you're eating yesterday's bread and drinking watered-down wine. At least Louis XVI didn't need to worry about that. In fact, he was probably too busy fancying his velvet cushions to notice the peasants slowly starving on the streets. Meanwhile, the clergy, who were supposed to be helping the poor, were the worst offenders of all. The church had its hands in everything. Land, wealth, tax exemptions, you name it. You had to pay a tithe, that's 10% of your income, just for the privilege of not going to hell. Meanwhile, the priests and bishops were living in luxury, untaxed and unbothered, sitting in their golden chairs while you scrambled to make ends meet. They weren't there to help you. No. They were there to control you with promises of divine rewards while they took the real rewards of your labour. The absurdity of it all? You're working yourself to the bone to pay taxes that benefit nobody but the rich, and if you're lucky, you'll get a few scraps to feed your family. But the rich? They'll be sipping their imported champagne, clinking glasses, and looking down their noses at you. They don't care that your hands are raw from weaving the fabric they wear, or that you don't have a bed to sleep in. They're too busy living their best lives immune to the consequences of the system they've rigged for themselves. Now, let's talk about justice. Or rather, the lack of it. If you thought life in 18th century France was unfair before, wait until you hear about the justice system. Spoiler alert, it wasn't designed to serve justice. No, it was set up to keep the nobles and clergy in power, while people like you, the poor worker, had no chance of getting a fair trial, let alone justice. Imagine this. You're a hard-working peasant, toiling away in a textile factory, and you accidentally bump into an aristocrat on the street. Normally, you'd expect an apology, maybe a shove and a sorry, but in the wonderful world of French justice, this could be enough to land you in court. If you're lucky enough to have a trial, it's not about what really happened, it's about who you know. Spoiler again, you don't know anyone who matters. The rich and well-connected, they're drinking wine and discussing the latest fashion trends in the palaces, while you're being dragged to court for accidentally knocking over a basket of bread. See, if you're poor in this system, justice doesn't work for you. It's more like trial by wealth. Money and connections determine your fate, not the facts. The rich have the power to buy their freedom, whether they've committed murder or just made some poor soul's life miserable. And if you're rich enough, you don't even have to go to trial. You get a pass, because why should the elite suffer the same fate as the common folk? For the poor, oh, you don't have that luxury. Your fate is sealed as soon as they see your tattered clothes and worn-out shoes. A little steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving kids. Guess what? You're now a criminal in the eyes of the law. You might end up in prison, or worse, dragged into the streets for a public execution, where the crowd can watch as the nobility shows up to cheer from their ivory towers. If you're really unlucky, they might even throw you in the galleys, a lovely experience where you're shackled to a boat and forced to row until you die. It's basically a vacation for the rich, and a death sentence for you. Here's the real kicker. If you're rich, you can literally get away with murder. Literally. Nobles were practically immune to justice. Murder someone? No problem. Just pay off the right people, like the judges or officials, and boom, case dismissed. Meanwhile, the poor get publicly flogged for thinking about stealing a loaf of bread. A system designed for the rich and against the poor? Absolutely. But it's not just the big crimes that are a problem. The little things were enough to land a poor soul in trouble. Ever been accused of speaking against the king? Well, that's treason, my friend. And treason was a good way to get your head chopped off. Forget about having a defense. If you were poor, your crime didn't matter. It was a formality. Just another day of being ruled over by the elite. So, what does this system teach you? Well, it teaches you that justice is reserved for the nobles, while you, the poor worker, are just fodder for the royal machine. The law wasn't about fairness. It was about keeping the rich on top and the poor exactly where they belonged, at the bottom. Now, if the monarchy, the nobility, the tax system and the justice system weren't enough to keep you down, let's talk about the role of the church, the real powerhouse in 18th century France. You see, while you're breaking your back in the factories, sweating over looms that seem to mock your every effort, the Catholic Church is living in luxury, occasionally sipping fine wine and throwing lavish feasts, all while preaching that your misery is just part of God's grand plan. How convenient, right? The Church wasn't just about spirituality. It was a political and economic empire. The priests and bishops were part of the ruling class, and they had land and wealth that would make today's billionaires jealous. You? Well, you were lucky if you got a few crumbs of stale bread after a hard day of work. But for the priests, they were tax exempt, living in grand palaces, all while preaching to you that you should just accept your suffering because heaven was coming for you someday. So, keep your head down, work hard, and don't even think about rebelling, because hey, there's a reward waiting for you, just not in this life. Yay, eternity. It's almost like the church was in cahoots with the nobility and monarchy, using religion to keep you obedient while the rich people lived like they were royalty. And in a way, they were. The church's sermons were basically a weekly reminder to be patient with your suffering, because God will take care of it later. So you've been working for 12 hours today and barely have enough to eat? Don't worry, you'll get your reward in heaven. Just don't question the system while you're still alive. But here's the really delicious irony. The church wasn't exactly living a life of humility. Priests were living in luxurious homes, wearing fine clothes, and feasting on food that would make any peasant green with envy. They'd preach about the importance of humility while wearing gold rings and eating their fill. It was the ultimate scam. The people were told that if they suffered in this life, they'd be rewarded in the next. Meanwhile, the church leaders were collecting tithes from the poor, getting tax exemptions and living like they were above the laws of the land, and it didn't stop there. The church also controlled knowledge. Superstition ran rampant, and instead of education, the poor had to rely on spiritual remedies for all their ailments. Want a cure for a headache? Don't ask a doctor, ask the priest to pray over you. The church had a monopoly on both your soul and your health, and let's just say, the results were less than impressive. You could be suffering from the plague, but the church would tell you that all you needed was a good confession and a holy prayer. It didn't really do much for your health, but hey, at least it kept you from questioning the status quo. So as you spent every day working yourself to the bone, the church sat at the top of the social pyramid, pulling the strings while preaching about patience and eternal rewards. It was the perfect system to keep the poor in check. Suffer now, be patient, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get a little something in the afterlife. But for now, well, for now, just keep weaving those fabrics, keep paying your taxes, and keep your mouth shut. The rich will keep getting richer, and you'll keep wondering when or if your heavenly reward will ever come. But if you thought living in poverty under a corrupt tax system and being exploited by the powerful was bad enough, let's add a little more fun to the mix. How about disease? And not just any disease, but the kind that spreads like wildfire in the filthy streets of Paris, where overcrowding and unsanitary conditions are the only things flourishing. Paris was packed to the brim with people, most of whom had no choice but to live in overcrowded slums. Imagine crammed tenements with no ventilation, where your next-door neighbour's stench could become your morning alarm clock. Hygiene was a luxury the poor couldn't afford. The streets were littered with human waste, and the sewage system? Oh, it was essentially non-existent. Instead of pipes to carry away waste, the streets were home to a lovely mix of rotting food, feces, and decaying bodies. A real-life horror show. All of this made the air thick with stench, but hey, at least the rich weren't anywhere near it. For you, the working class though, dodging the smells was just the beginning. If you were lucky enough to avoid stepping into a puddle of filth, you were then faced with the threat of disease. Cholera, smallpox, or the ever-present plague. These weren't just names you heard whispered by the firelight. No, they were real threats that could wipe out entire neighbourhoods in a matter of days. The poor were especially vulnerable because, well, they didn't have the luxury of staying inside their grand homes like the nobility. The rich could afford to isolate themselves from the masses living in clean, comfortable houses, while you had to scramble through filthy streets, exposed to every bacteria-infested rat and plague-bearing flea. The lack of sanitation ensured that the diseases spread quickly. Imagine waking up every day, wondering if today would be the day you'd fall ill to cholera or smallpox. No one was safe, especially not the poor who couldn't afford any kind of medical care. If you got sick, you were stuck with home remedies that range from prayers to drinking strange potions handed to you by the local quack doctors. Want a miracle cure? A little holy water should do the trick. Maybe rub some herbs on your chest while chanting something about the Almighty. After all, science hadn't quite caught up yet, and medicine was just as superstitious as it was ineffective. Now, imagine the absurdity of it all. While the rich were sitting pretty, sipping wine and laughing in their clean homes, the poor were literally drowning in disease and death. But the real kicker was this: the church didn't care. After all, their job was to tell you to suffer now, because heaven was waiting for you. So, while you're dodging cholera, the priests were offering salvation, which frankly wasn't as helpful as a clean water supply. The whole thing was one big unfortunate joke. The overcrowded slums, the disease, the lack of sanitation, all stacked against the poor while the wealthy lived a safe, disease-free existence. It was the perfect storm of misery, and the rich. They were too busy throwing lavish parties and complaining about the quality of their silk to even notice. Meanwhile, you were just hoping to survive another day of illness in a city that felt like it was suffocating you at every turn. As we've seen, 18th century France was a society built on inequality, where the monarchy, nobility and church held all the power, wealth and comfort, while the working class was left to suffer in overcrowded slums, struggling with disease and burdened by taxes. The tax system ensured that the poor, like you, carried the weight of the kingdom's debts, while the rich were free to live lavishly without consequence. The justice system, rigged from the start, ensured that if you were poor, your fate was sealed before you even stepped into court. But despite the monarchy's lavish lifestyle and the church's role in keeping people down, the resentment in the air was palpable. The inequalities were so vast and the suffering so widespread that it's clear something was bound to give. The discontent was building, and the system was wearing thin. The poor were no longer content with their place in society. They could see the chasm between the rich and the poor, and the desire for change was starting to grow. The system couldn't stay intact forever, and soon enough, that desire for change would ignite something much bigger than any one person could imagine: the beginning of the French Revolution. As the French monarchy continued to bask in its opulence, and the aristocracy revelled in untaxed luxury, the rest of the world, particularly the common folk, was quietly getting tired of it. And then came the Enlightenment, a movement that would forever change the way people viewed power, authority, and the self. The Enlightenment wasn't just about fancy philosophical ideas. It was about demanding change. It was a time when thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu started to chip away at the foundations of the old system. The big idea: reason, individual liberty, and equality. For centuries, the monarchy and church had claimed divine right and unquestionable authority. And suddenly these thinkers were saying, wait a minute, how about we all just agree to live in a society where everyone has a say? At the heart of the Enlightenment was the idea that humans were capable of thinking for themselves. No more blindly following kings or priests who told you your life's purpose was to suffer for the promise of heaven. Take Voltaire, for example. He absolutely shredded the church and absolute monarchy with his satirical wit, arguing that freedom of speech and religious tolerance were non-negotiable. Meanwhile, Rousseau came along and introduced his social contract, stating that true sovereignty belonged to the people and that the king wasn't God's direct representative, but just another person who had been put in power. And let's not forget Montesquieu, who had the bright idea that power should be divided into 3 branches to prevent any one group from having too much, because absolute power, he said, was a recipe for tyranny. Now imagine this. You, the poor worker, struggling in the factories, barely able to scrape by, suddenly reading about these Enlightenment ideas and thinking, hey, maybe I don't have to be miserable forever. Maybe there's another way. These ideas didn't just stay in the ivory towers of intellectuals. They spread like wildfire through pamphlets, speeches and debates, and soon common folk were starting to ask, why should we accept this system where we work to feed the rich while they throw lavish banquets and sip watered-down wine? So, while the nobles lived their carefree lives, Voltaire and Rousseau were planting the seeds of a revolution of ideas that would soon explode beyond the pages of books and into the streets of Paris. Now that we've discussed the Enlightenment as a whole, and how it began to challenge the monarchical system and the church, let's dive deeper into the ideas of some key Enlightenment thinkers and see how their radical thoughts started to turn the intellectual tide toward revolutionary change. Let's start with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher who had the audacity to say, "You know, maybe the people should actually get to decide who's in charge." Rousseau's social contract was nothing short of a blueprint for revolution. In his view, sovereignty didn't belong to kings or divine right. It belonged to the people. The idea that government should exist only by the will of the people directly challenged the absolute monarchy France had been living under for centuries. The Third Estate, tired of living in poverty while the nobles lived in excess, began reading Rousseau and thinking, wait a minute, we can change this. His general will philosophy suggested that people, as a collective, should determine what's best for society, which meant the people could potentially overthrow a tyrannical government. Now, doesn't that sound like a plan to spark a revolution? Next, we have Voltaire, the man who could out-sarcasm anyone. If you were a noble or clergy in 18th century France and you found yourself under Voltaire's microscope, well, good luck. Voltaire was the king of criticism, particularly when it came to the absolute monarchy and the church. He wasn't afraid to say, monarchy, nah, that's a thing of the past, and religion, well, it's good for keeping people in line, but I'd prefer a little bit of freedom of speech. Voltaire's famous attacks on the corruption of the clergy and royalty through his satirical writings made him a thorn in the side of those in power. As Voltaire jabbed at the hypocrisy of those in charge, people like you, the poor worker, began to feel that maybe, just maybe, there was a better way to live. Then there's Montesquieu, who decided to give the idea of government a little spice by saying, what if we didn't put all the power in one person's hands? Montesquieu's separation of powers theory was revolutionary in its simplicity. Why not split the government into 3 branches so that no one could control everything? Sure, you didn't have to be a political genius to realize that absolute power could easily lead to tyranny, but Montesquieu showed how power could be balanced to avoid abuse. And this idea, it didn't just resonate with the intellectual elite, it became a radical new way of thinking about governance that inspired many to demand change in their own country. These Enlightenment thinkers didn't just sit in theoretical ivory towers. Their ideas began to spread through pamphlets, public debates, and the growing number of political clubs. The poor, who had spent centuries under the boot of the monarchy, began to think, why shouldn't we have a say in how we're governed? It wasn't just an academic exercise anymore. The concept of democracy, of the people's right to govern themselves, was beginning to take root in the streets of Paris. But the nobility, they were still too busy with their lavish parties, their golden goblets, and their expensive wigs to realize that the wind of change was starting to blow in the streets. They'd soon find out, though, that ideas like Rousseau's social contract were not just words. They were a blueprint for revolution. As the Enlightenment ideas continued to spread through pamphlets, salons, and public debates, the Third Estate, that's you, the poor worker, the peasant, the labourer, began to see the cracks in the system. Rousseau's idea of the social contract didn't just sound like fancy philosophy anymore. It felt like a personal invitation for change. Voltaire's critiques of the church and absolute monarchy started to feel like righteous indignation echoing in the streets. Montesquieu's call for the separation of powers, that wasn't just a political theory, that was freedom. The intellectuals had done their part. They had opened the door to revolutionary thought, and now it was time for real-world action. The common people, tired of being exploited, began to see the possibility of change. For so long, you had accepted that you were destined to be poor, that the nobility would always live above you, that the monarchy was the only way things could be. But these new ideas, they were changing the game. They planted a seed in your mind, and now that seed was beginning to grow. While the nobles were still living in their golden palaces, throwing lavish feasts and complaining about the quality of their silk, the poor were starting to wake up. You could no longer ignore the glaring inequalities. While the elite sipped their imported wines and dined on delicacies, you were lucky if you could get a crust of stale bread. Your lunch was a distant thought because you spent your day bent over a loom for hours, making fabric that would end up in their wardrobes, fabric that would be sold to them at a price you could never afford. But why should they have all the luxuries while you were barely scraping by? Then there was the economy, or rather, the lack of it. The food prices were rising, the bread shortages were getting worse, and the monarchy kept spending like there was no tomorrow. Louis XVI was practically bankrupting the country, funding wars that didn't benefit you, and paying for a court that seemed to have no real concern for the people they were supposed to govern. Meanwhile, the nobles and clergy were exempt from taxes, and the peasants and workers like you, well, you were paying for the privileges of those who had no intention of changing anything. How long could this system last before the pressure became too much? As the debates around equality, freedom and democracy spread, the ideas of the Enlightenment were no longer just a discussion. They were fueling a fire. Small groups began to gather in political clubs, exchanging ideas about a new world where the people had power. Not the king, not the nobles, not the church. The intellectuals were no longer speaking to an elite few. They were speaking to the masses, and the masses were listening. As discontent continued to grow, so did the idea that change wasn't just a theoretical wish, it was within reach. The revolution was coming. The system was too broken to fix, and while the nobility continued to ignore the storm on the horizon, the Third Estate, the common people, the workers, the peasants, were ready for change. And they weren't just going to talk about it anymore, they were going to make it happen. By the time the Enlightenment ideas had taken root among the common people, it was clear. Change wasn't just a philosophical idea anymore, it was an urgent necessity. The old regime, with its absolute monarchy, privileged nobility, and subjugated peasants, was rotting from the inside out. The poverty of the Third Estate had been ignored for too long, the tax system was unfair, and the economic crisis was deepening. The masses were restless, and for the first time, the idea of a revolution didn't feel like a far-off fantasy. It felt like the only option. The financial collapse of France had been building for years. King Louis XVI's lavish spending, funding wars that brought no benefit to the poor, was draining the royal treasury. The monarchy had no solution. Meanwhile, the common people, peasants, workers and the poor, were left to struggle with rising food prices, famine and skyrocketing taxes. The nobles? They enjoyed their tax exemptions and were untouched by the suffering of the people. This injustice became increasingly intolerable, and the seeds of revolution were sprouting in the minds of the Third Estate. Enter the Estates General, a last-ditch attempt by Louis XVI to address the financial crisis. It was supposed to be a forum for all three estates, clergy, nobility and common people, to discuss solutions. But when the Third Estate showed up, they quickly realised they were being marginalised. They were outnumbered and had no real power in the decision-making process. That's when things started to get interesting. Rather than accepting their place as second-class citizens, the Third Estate made a bold move. They declared themselves the National Assembly, signalling their intention to reshape the French government. Louis XVI was still in denial, thinking he could ignore this growing discontent. But the Third Estate was no longer asking for change. They were demanding it. The tension reached its boiling point on July 14, 1789, when the people of Paris, inspired by Enlightenment ideas, stormed the Bastille, the symbol of royal oppression. The fall of the Bastille wasn't just the capture of a prison, it was a symbolic victory for the people. It marked the beginning of the revolution, as the monarchy's control over Paris, over France, began to crumble. The Bastille, once thought to be impregnable, has been taken by the people. This was the moment when the old regime realized that they were no longer the unquestioned rulers. They were out of touch with the people, and the people were no longer willing to stay silent. But of course the aristocrats didn't see it that way. They were still living in their palaces, blind to the storm that was brewing in the streets. Louis XVI and his court continued to feast and discuss matters of fashion and luxury, completely unaware that their privileged world was about to come crashing down. As the National Assembly began to work toward a new constitution, the old regime was facing its collapse, and this time there was no way to stop the tide of change that was coming. The people, armed with new ideas, were ready to reclaim their power, and they were no longer willing to accept a system that had oppressed them for centuries. The storming of the Bastille had shaken the monarchy to its core. For centuries, the Bastille stood as a symbol of royal power, an imposing fortress that represented the oppression and tyranny of the monarchy. When the people of Paris stormed its gates on July 14, 1789, it wasn't just the bricks and mortar of the prison that fell. It was the psychological foundation of the old regime. The Bastille's fall signified that the people no longer feared the monarchy. It was a symbolic victory for the revolutionaries, a moment when they realized that they could no longer be ignored. But with the Bastille's collapse came the realization that dismantling the monarchy was one thing, but building something entirely new would take more than symbolic victories. Following the storming of the Bastille, the National Assembly, formed by the Third Estate, the common people, faced a daunting task: how to replace the old decaying structures of power with a new system of governance. But while the revolutionaries celebrated the fall of the Bastille, the work of dismantling centuries of social, political and economic hierarchies had only just begun. The first significant step toward creating a new order came with the abolition of feudal privileges on August 4th, 1789. For centuries, the nobility and the clergy had enjoyed exemptions from taxes and privileges that ensured their control over land and wealth. Feudalism, the system in which peasants worked the land in exchange for protection from the aristocracy, had long kept the Third Estate in poverty. Noble landowners enjoyed immense wealth, while the common people toiled away in abject misery. The National Assembly realized that if they were to dismantle the old system and replace it with something that offered true equality, then feudalism had to be eradicated. And so, with a stroke of a pen, the National Assembly abolished the feudal privileges that had kept the aristocracy and clergy in power for so long. Taxes that had once been levied only on the poor were now to be shared by all. The privileges of the nobility, such as their exemption from military service or their control over peasants, were swept away. But while this was a monumental victory, it also created a new set of challenges. How to manage the land now in the hands of the state, how to ensure that peasants were treated fairly in the wake of such a drastic change. Next came the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, arguably the most important document produced by the National Assembly in these early days of the Revolution. Drafted by figures like Thomas Jefferson, Marquis de Lafayette and Abbé Sieyès, the Declaration was a profound statement of the revolutionary ideals that would guide the French Revolution forward. It proclaimed that all men are born free and equal in dignity and rights, a radical assertion that rejected the long-standing belief in the divine right of kings and feudal society. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was built on principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the three pillars that would define the French Revolution and shape the political landscape for years to come. It stated that sovereignty belonged not to the king, but to the people. It proclaimed that all men had the right to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It also demanded freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the separation of powers in government. Ideas that had been championed by Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. However, while the Declaration was a visionary document, it raised some compelling questions. Who would be considered a citizen in this new republic? Would the rights of women and minorities be guaranteed, or was this declaration only for the men of property? The National Assembly had declared that all men are equal, but the question of who counted as equal was still unresolved. Would the aristocrats who had been stripped of their privileges be included in the new society, or would they be seen as enemies of the revolution, to be removed entirely from political life? The Declaration of the Rights of Man was a bold, radical statement that laid the groundwork for the future of the Republic, but its implementation would require more than just words on paper. It was one thing to declare that everyone had the right to freedom and equality, but it was another to actually create a society that could deliver on those promises. The revolutionaries knew that dismantling the old system was just the first step, but how would they build something new from the ashes of the old regime? With the abolition of feudal privileges and the Declaration of Rights, the National Assembly set its sights on the next phase of revolution. The Church, which had long been a pillar of royal power, was now in the crosshairs of the revolutionaries. The Church had exploited the poor for centuries, amassing wealth and influence while the peasants lived in misery. The National Assembly quickly moved to nationalize the Church, placing it under the control of the state. This was not just a religious reform, it was a political one. By seizing control of the Church's land and wealth, the Assembly further weakened the power of the monarchy and the aristocracy, who had long relied on the Church's support to maintain their privileges. In 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy was enacted, which required priests and bishops to swear an oath of loyalty to the state. The clergy, once an unquestioned authority, now found themselves caught in the middle of the revolution. Many priests resisted the new law, claiming that it undermined the authority of the Pope. The division between those who accepted the new reforms and those who remained loyal to the Pope created a religious schism that would divide French society for years to come. Meanwhile, the monarchy itself was beginning to unravel. The royal family, led by Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette, had fled Versailles in an attempt to escape the revolution. They had hoped to find sanctuary in Varennes, but their escape plan was foiled when they were recognized and brought back to Paris in disgrace. The royal family was now held under house arrest, and the French people began to see the monarchy as a corrupt institution that could not be allowed to stand in the way of the new republic. As the revolutionaries debated the future of the monarchy, the people were growing more radical. The king's failure to escape and the people's growing desire for equality pushed the revolution toward more extreme actions. With the fall of the Bastille, the abolition of feudal privileges, the Declaration of Rights, and the nationalisation of the church, the old regime was officially in ruins. But the French Revolution had only just begun. The question of how to replace the old system with something truly egalitarian and just still loomed large. The National Assembly had made incredible strides, but the revolutionaries were about to discover that the path to a new world would not be an easy one. The idealism of the early days was beginning to clash with the harsh realities of implementing change. The people had won their first battles, but the wars of the revolution were far from over. The old order had crumbled, but what would replace it? Equality, liberty, and fraternity were the goals. But how would the people build a new government that could deliver on these promises? As the revolutionaries worked toward creating a new constitution, the streets of Paris were boiling with tension. The revolutionaries, energized by their victories, were preparing for what they hoped would be the birth of a new nation, a nation founded on the ideals of the Enlightenment, a nation where all men were equal. But as the monarchy struggled to hold on, and the revolutionaries began to face the internal divisions of their own making, the question of how to build a new republic remained. The French Revolution had reached its zenith. The monarchy was in ruins, and the National Assembly had transformed into a revolutionary government that seemed unstoppable. The storming of the Bastille and the Declaration of the Rights of Man were just the beginning. But the revolution was more than a mere struggle for power. It was an effort to redefine the very nature of society itself. The old order was collapsing, and as the revolutionaries tore down the structures that had kept them in chains, a new question arose. What would rise from the ashes? By the time the Reign of Terror began, the revolution had reached a pivotal point. The early ideals of freedom, equality, and fraternity had been replaced by the brutal necessity of survival. As external threats from other European monarchies grew, and internal divisions threatened to tear apart the fragile revolution, the Committee of Public Safety emerged as the central body guiding the future of France. At the head of this committee stood a man whose name would become synonymous with the extremes of revolutionary fervour, Maximilien Robespierre. The revolution had been birthed out of hope and idealism, but it was now being shaped by the harsh realities of power. Robespierre's vision for the revolution was not merely about changing the monarchy. It was about creating a pure republic, one where the virtues of liberty and equality would not just be declared, but enforced. For Robespierre, virtue was non-negotiable. The revolution would not survive unless it was pure, and purity meant purging those who threatened its ideals. However, the very revolutionary fervour that had ignited the hearts of the common people began to devour those same people. As Robespierre's grip on power tightened, his vision for virtue grew more rigid. What began as a push for justice and equality transformed into an unrelenting campaign to eliminate anything or anyone that threatened the revolution's purity. And so, under Robespierre's direction, the Reign of Terror began, a period marked by fear, suspicion, and above all violence. As the revolution entered its most violent phase, Robespierre's ideological purity became his downfall. The guillotine, which had once symbolized the people's power over a tyrannical king, became a tool of absolute control, wielded not just against royalists and counter-revolutionaries, but also against the revolutionaries themselves. The very men and women who had once fought beside Robespierre were now falling victim to his uncompromising vision. The national conscience was torn apart by the endless demands for virtue, and Robespierre's obsession with justice led him to declare war on his own people. Robespierre's purges began with the Girondins, those who had once shared his commitment to the revolution. but who now found themselves branded as enemies of the state. No one was safe from the Revolutionary Tribunal, and the once idealistic revolutionaries, eager to implement a new society, found themselves buried beneath the weight of their own creation. Danton, the once heroic figure of the revolution, was also swept up in this madness. Having been a part of the Committee of Public Safety, Danton and his followers now stood on the opposite side of the revolutionary barricade. They called for an end to the terror, but to Robespierre their call was tantamount to treason. What had begun as a struggle for freedom now turned into a fight for survival. Robespierre the Incorruptible was slowly becoming the embodiment of the very tyranny he had once opposed. But as the guillotine claimed more and more lives, Robespierre found himself increasingly isolated. His unwavering idealism became his undoing, as it alienated those who had once supported him. His downfall came swiftly. Once the symbol of revolutionary virtue, he was now seen as the chief architect of the violence that had consumed France. The Thermidorian reaction, as it came to be known, marked the end of Robespierre's reign. In 1794, as he stood before the National Convention, Robespierre's calls for further purges were met not with applause but with hostility. His allies, fearful for their own lives, turned on him. Robespierre, who had once been the guardian of the revolution's sacred ideals, was arrested and executed, his fall as dramatic as the rise that had brought him to the pinnacle of power. Robespierre's death was not the death of the revolution, but it marked the beginning of the end for the radical phase of the revolution. With his execution, the reign of terror came to an end, and France began to shift toward a more moderate phase of its revolutionary struggle. But Robespierre's legacy would endure in the form of the revolutionary ideals he had championed: liberty, equality, and fraternity, even though they were never fully realized in his lifetime. The fall of Robespierre signified a turning point in the French Revolution. The radical phase that had been characterized by extreme violence and moral absolutism was over, but the revolution was far from finished. With Robespierre's execution, the revolutionaries found themselves at a crossroads. They had overthrown the monarchy, abolished the feudal system, and created a new republic. But the question of what to do next was still unresolved. The vision of equality and liberty remained a distant dream, one that would need to be reconciled with the realities of governance. France would soon enter a new phase of the revolution, a phase marked by political turmoil, economic instability, and the rise of a new kind of leadership. The moderates would come to the forefront, but they would be forced to confront the chaos left in the wake of the revolution's radical past. As France turned its attention to the future, the ideas of the revolution would continue to evolve. The legacy of Robespierre, though flawed, remained a significant part of the revolutionary ethos. His commitment to virtue and justice, though taken to dangerous extremes, had exposed the deep tensions within the revolution itself. The future of France would depend on reconciling the dreams of the revolution with the harsh realities of its aftermath, and that would take more than just idealism. As the revolution moved forward, it would be shaped by new leaders, new ideas, and new challenges. One such leader, a man with grand ambitions, was already beginning to make his mark on the French political stage, a man who would rise from the chaos and ultimately change the course of French history. As the dust settled from the Reign of Terror and Maximilien Robespierre's fall marked the end of the radical phase of the French Revolution, a new set of challenges arose. The revolution was still in full swing, but the need for a more pragmatic approach was clear. The lofty ideals of equality, liberty, and fraternity were still on the table, but the country was in ruins. France was embroiled in foreign wars plagued by internal dissent and suffering from an economy that had collapsed under the strain of years of conflict and revolutionary excess. It was at this critical juncture that Georges Danton, one of the revolution's most charismatic leaders, began to play a central role. Unlike Robespierre, who had been known for his uncompromising commitment to moral virtue and radical ideals, Danton was the pragmatist, a man who understood that survival in the midst of revolution required a mix of realism and ruthlessness. He was the leader who sought to protect the revolution, but with a keen understanding of the need for flexibility in order to keep the revolutionary cause alive. Danton had been an early advocate for the Republic and had played an essential role in the storming of the Bastille. His fiery speeches and impassioned calls for action made him a figurehead for the revolution's most radical forces. But Danton was not as interested in idealistic purity as Robespierre was. For Danton, the revolution wasn't about abstract ideals, it was about practical results. Liberty and equality were important, but they had to be achieved through action, not just philosophical musings. In the wake of the Terror, Danton found himself at the centre of the political struggle that would define the next phase of the French Revolution. With Robespierre's fall, the radicals began to lose their influence, and Danton, who had always been more moderate, emerged as a key figure in the transitional period. He advocated for restoring some semblance of order to France, a France that was in shambles, torn apart by violence, and governed by the fear of counter-revolutionaries. Danton's pragmatism soon led him to oppose the continued extremism of Robespierre's followers. He criticised the excessive use of the guillotine, urging for the end of the Terror and for political stability to return. His calls for moderation and a shift away from revolutionary violence were in direct contrast to the radical Jacobins, who still believed in the purge of enemies to preserve the revolution's purity. In Danton's eyes, the violence had gone on long enough, and it was time to focus on rebuilding the nation, not destroying it further. However, as is often the case in revolutions, Danton's pragmatic approach quickly made him enemies among the radical factions. His calls for moderation were seen by many as a betrayal of the revolution's founding principles. Danton had once been one of the most fervent advocates for revolutionary violence, and now, it seemed, he was willing to abandon those very ideals to preserve his political position. But the revolutionary tide was too strong, and Danton, despite his pragmatism, could not escape the sweeping changes that were taking place. The Jacobins, still wielding the power they had gained during the Terror, saw Danton's attempts at moderation as a dangerous compromise. Eventually, his rivals within the revolutionary government turned on him, accusing him of being a counter-revolutionary, a traitor to the cause. The same forces that had once hailed him as a hero now saw him as an obstacle to the revolution's survival. In 1794, Danton was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death by the very guillotine he had once so fiercely supported. His execution marked the end of his political career, but also signalled the end of the Terror and the beginning of a new phase in the revolution. A phase where the radical idealism of Robespierre and his followers was replaced by more moderate forces that sought to move away from the extremes of the previous years. What is striking about Danton's legacy is not just his advocacy for moderation, but the contrast between his initial idealism and his pragmatic turn. Danton was a man who understood that revolutions are not just about ideals, they're about survival, and in order to survive, sometimes the best ideals must be sacrificed. His fatal mistake, however, was assuming that he could control the revolutionary forces he had helped unleash. The revolution, once ignited, had its own momentum, and Danton could not stop it. As he moved away from the violence of the Terror, he found himself on the wrong side of the political divide. Not radical enough to please the Jacobins, but too radical for the moderates. Danton's death was a reminder that in the world of revolutions, even the most charismatic leaders could fall victim to the very forces they had helped create. His pragmatic approach to the revolution, once seen as a necessary counterbalance to the extremism of the Jacobins, ultimately led to his downfall. Danton's fate was sealed when he was caught in the crossfire between the radicals and the moderates, caught between a desire for political stability and the revolutionary zeal that had made him famous in the first place. Despite his execution, Danton's influence on the French Revolution cannot be overstated. His pragmatic approach was a warning to the revolutionary leaders who followed him. No matter how noble your intentions or how well-meaning your calls for change, the revolution, once started, would consume those who dared to take part in it. His legacy, as a leader who sought balance, who believed in compromise, and who ultimately died for his moderation, remains as tragic as it is instructive. Danton, in many ways, was the man of compromise in a time that demanded extremes. He died because he had sought to end the violence, to turn the revolution from bloodshed back toward the path of reconstruction. But, in the end, his fate mirrored that of so many in the revolution. It was impossible to escape the forces he had helped to set in motion. The French Revolution was a story of ideals, struggles, and sacrifices. What began as a dream for liberty, equality, and fraternity quickly descended into a chaotic battle where idealism clashed with pragmatism and the revolutionary forces turned inward, devouring their own. Figures like Robespierre, Danton, and countless others navigated the delicate balance between freedom and order, their actions shaping the course of history. Yet, the revolution's excesses, its violence, and the loss of its most fervent leaders ultimately highlighted the dangers of unchecked power, no matter how noble the cause. Despite the terror and turmoil, the French Revolution laid the foundation for the modern world. It overthrew the monarchy, dismantled feudalism, and championed human rights. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen echoed through time, inspiring revolutions across the globe, emphasizing the people's sovereignty and the inviolability of human dignity. While France did not immediately find peace or stability, the revolution set in motion the creation of a society based on democracy, citizenship, and equal rights. In the end, the French Revolution proved that while idealism can be brutal, it is often the spark for a better society. One that, though flawed, would continue to evolve, with its echoes still reverberating today.